Coming up on Big Giant Heads.
Before the accident, there was a possibility that I could have simply gotten away with the stunt, and I was prepared for the repercussions if I didn't. My dad would have been furious, but I would have been famous.
When we talk about troublemaker phase, by giving it context, giving them the vocabulary, she's going to take your interpretation of it, not the schools, the peers, other people who may not understand.
Welcome back. You're listening to episode 3 of the Big Giant Heads podcast. I'm David.
And I'm Megan. No cameras today?
I know the camera loves you, baby, but we're going to lighten things up for the sake of getting more episodes out faster.
Makes sense.
And we're going to start doing other segments as well as guest interviews. But today we have it all. A new story.
Nice.
A new segment.
Hell yeah.
And a guest. Tracy Cassels is the host of the Evolutionary Parenting Podcast.
I thought this wasn't a parenting show.
It's not, but I think she can shed some light on some of the quirky behaviors in this episode's story.
You mean your quirky behaviors? I have some ideas about them too.
I bet you do.
Well, you're up first, story man.
This one's called Troublemakers. When I was a kid, what I lacked in athletic ability, I made up for with a healthy dose of hyperactivity. In the summer, I'd race around our neighborhood announcing my presence with the motorbike sounds created by the basketball cards slapping between the spokes of my bike. In the winter, I'd tirelessly drag my GT snow racer up snowy hills for the 10-second thrill of flying past anyone on a lesser sled. Basically, if it drew attention, I was into it. And for the most part, this boundless energy was harmless. Except for those pesky days in the structured environment of 4th grade. This was around the time my dad started getting calls from the school for what was described to him as attention-seeking and disruptive behavior. One incident even resulted in a week-long suspension. This had never happened to me before, so everyone took it very seriously. At the start of this suspension, I learned I wouldn't be in regular classes. Instead, I was placed with other like-minded students in a small meeting room next to the front office. And if it wasn't for the large window facing the main hall, I might have actually enjoyed the change of scenery. But as it was, from the other side of this large window, I just imagined we looked like specimens in an exhibit of troublemakers, each of us depicting a different evolutionary stage of delinquent. I knew the younger kid by reputation. Earlier that year, he'd dropped a chocolate bar into the library terrarium. Clearly disappointed, the librarian had left it sealed inside, presumably to show us all how unfunny it was to watch the plants wither and die. But months later, it still just looked like she was keeping a pet turd. And though I couldn't deny the humor, I felt this prank was a product of the earliest form of troublemaker, like early man just learning to use tools. The older kid, on the other hand, seemed like a more seasoned hoodlum. I didn't know him personally, but I knew why he was suspended. The previous week, he had set fire to a paper towel dispenser in one of the bathrooms. I didn't know exactly how he was caught, but he spoke proudly that his technique never failed. I assume this meant he was a creature of habit, a creature of the later, more evolved, fire-wielding Troublemaker Tribes, that, unfortunately, made it easy to identify him as the responsible pyromaniac. Was I the missing link between these two? It seemed we each wanted a little attention, albeit different ways of getting it. For me, it was about showing people I was special in some way. Pranks or destructive behavior weren't for me. I wanted people to see me as a unique and rare specimen in an exclusive exhibit of my own design. The next thing I learned about suspension was that we still had to do our classwork. In the mornings, our homeroom teacher dropped off the day's assignments and instructed us to have it all completed the following morning. Then I learned we wouldn't even have recess. This was when we were to speak to a counselor about why we were suspended and what we would do so it wouldn't happen again. The counselor wasn't part of the regular school staff. I would have remembered him because he was obese in a way that young kids like me find fascinating. Unsurprisingly, the other guys were well acquainted with his hulking presence. Mr. Warren was a regional counselor the school brought in for special cases, and I had to assume he was some kind of behavioral expert because I couldn't imagine someone with his outward appearance being hired without excellent credentials. This also made me think he might be a little overqualified for me. Sure, I might have wanted to be seen as special, but that didn't mean I wanted special help. It just always seemed like my good intentions were overshadowed by some miscalculation of my abilities. In this case, the incident that got me suspended began a few months earlier. It was during recess one day that I noticed one of the janitors on the roof of the school. It was obvious this was a special occasion because the older kids were pointing up and cheering, and we followed their lead as they gathered below where the janitor was shuffling around above. It looked like he was cleaning, but no one would have been excited about that. Then suddenly he stopped, and, as if by magic, began throwing down tennis balls, basketballs, frisbees, and Nerf toys. He was cleaning the roof of all the toys that had gotten stuck up there over the last few months. But strangely, it seemed he didn't think anyone was worthy of these muddy, rain-soaked toys, because he tossed each of them away from the excited crowd. In the scramble, some kids would try to claim a toy they had personally lost. But when the janitor finished, it didn't matter who got what. The toys were enjoyed by all on the playground that day. The 8-year-old version of me probably wasn't as colorful with this story. I imagine all Mr. Warren heard was, "I wanted to throw things from the roof." But after a few labored breaths, he calmly said he could understand why it looked like an exciting thing to do. Of course it was exciting, but this was the last thing I expected to hear from a man of his physical dimension. On the second day of counseling, the other kids in our fishbowl of insolence seemed a little more hostile to me than the day before. After being accused as a big mouth, they told me they had overheard Mr. Warren sharing my story with the principal. Apparently, the rest of the school wasn't aware of the janitor toy-tossing tradition. And later I'd realized that from that day on, it would never be the same way again. Only while we were inside looking out a window would we occasionally see toys seemingly fall from the sky. Sure, some kids still might appreciate the surprise, but those that were there for my stunt would know how it used to be. On day 3 of my counseling, Mr. Warren took me for a walk around the school grounds. He was curious how I had gotten on the roof. Coincidentally, I was curious how long of a walk he was actually capable of, because though I was annoyed at my loose-lipped carelessness, I was also now anxious about telling him anything else. So I tried to drag the conversation out as long as possible. I started by explaining that I just really liked climbing, whereas, in reality, I'd thought carefully about my approach. The janitors would have accessed the roof through off-limits corridors and doors with "Do Not Enter" signs. Those signs meant business, and if somehow they weren't locked, there'd be no denying my defiance. So I decided on an approach best suited to my boundless energy. Parkour wasn't a thing yet, but I had been bouncing off the walls since I could walk. So all I needed was a narrow enough gap between two walls, and I could easily lift myself as high as the walls would go. Basically, I knew overtly breaking the rules was worse than testing boundaries. For the janitors, it was just about clearing the roof. But for me, this was an opportunity to show the school what I was capable of. And with this approach, I also had plausible deniability. "I was just trying to get my ball back." "Oh, you're not supposed to climb on the roof?" Mr. Warren showed a surprising amount of stamina as we repeatedly circled the school while I told him everything except the truth. The whole time he followed along, breathing heavily, but listening attentively. Only as the bell rang did we finally stop. But we didn't follow everyone back inside. Instead, Mr. Warren motioned to a bench near the playground. I noted, before he sat down, he inspected the seat for dirt, as if scuffed trousers would be the first thing anyone would notice about him. Mr. Warren wore the same tailored outfit every day, and I was beginning to wonder how we kept it all together. Here was this colossal man who I assume probably didn't have a friend in the world, but who carried himself with little to no regard to this obvious disability. Where did he get his confidence? The kind of attention he must get simply by his physical appearance boggled my mind. And yet, here he was, counseling kids like me. Kids who felt the need to plan elaborate stunts to get noticed by anyone. From the carefree vantage point of the playground, we could see the classrooms filling back up with students. Mr. Warren asked me about my favorite subject and if I looked forward to going back to regular classes. Again, I felt apprehensive about divulging any information. But he had followed me this far. I figured the least I could do was open up a little. My favorite subject was art. I wasn't particularly good at it, but I was most comfortable with the open-ended exercises. It also seemed like something I could get good at, something I could be known for. Unlike what I assumed I'd be known for when I rejoined the rest of my classes. I told Mr. Warren I really wasn't looking forward to going back to class. I had humiliated myself, and that was the exact opposite of what I was trying to do. I decided I had to explain myself. After making my way onto the roof and collecting a few soggy toys, I then peeked over the edge near the playground. Like a superhero dramatically revealing himself to the world, I stood up and looked out at the civilians playing below. I called out, "Hey!" The kids closest looked up at me, but from their expressions the sentiment was mostly confusion. It hadn't occurred to me that I'd need to clarify why I was on the roof and yelling at everyone. So I grabbed the biggest toy I could find, a basketball. I held it above my head and yelled out once more. Mr. Warren had me recount what happened next a few times. "Everyone said you threw the ball at them." Of course I did. But this was how we learned that the janitors weren't playing naughty or nice having us chase after the toys. They were simply avoiding any accidents by throwing everything away from the crowd. The janitors were professionals. They were the real heroes. I, on the other hand, enjoyed only a few seconds of celebrity before the ball, with its moldy grip, slipped through the hands and slammed directly into a kid's face. The crowd froze. I froze. They all looked up at me and then back to the kid, who was now covering his face. Blood began to drip from his hands. All I could hear was a collective, "Oh!" from down below. Then the sounds of kids running in different directions yelling for help. Now I could feel my face getting hotter as my eyes swelled from a flood of overwhelming new consequences. Before the accident, there was a possibility that I could have simply gotten away with the stunt, and I was prepared for the repercussions if I didn't. It would have just been another call home. My dad would have been furious, but I would have been famous. On the last day of suspension, I was the only troublemaker left in the little room. Mr. Warren brought a box of 12 donuts, which at first I foolishly thought were just for him. But after completing some paperwork, he clarified they were to share. "I couldn't eat these all by myself." We both laughed at the idea, each of us comfortably aware of the irony. Near the end of the day, Mr. Warren visited me once more. He wished me luck with my art, and reassured me he understood I didn't have any malicious intent with my stunt. At the time, I didn't realize how important that was to me. After our week together, I just hoped he'd remember me for more than my stunt.
David, that was a really beautiful story about something you built up in your head that backfires in the biggest sense. And you had a lot of growth through it.
I'm not sure if the growth I reflected in the story today is as much as I felt then, but it definitely was pivotal because, as we know, this is a two-parter. But do you have any experiences like that?
Not so much of a troublemaker. I erred on the teacher side. And I was a shy kid, but I never wanted to be just the shy kid. Like, I did want to have loads of friends. I did want to be at the front, like those kind of things. But I had no social understanding of trying to build friend groups or stay loyal to friend groups if it was about doing what's right from the teacher's perspective. Like one time I found out 2 girls had plugged the toilets in the girls' bathrooms and they were all overflowing. And they had told me, and like the teacher had come in and been like, "Who did this? Put your hand up if you know." And I was like, "Oh, I know." Like I was so naive about keeping that to myself. I was thinking about it in a vacuum. Oh, teacher asks, "Do you have the answer to this question?" Megan goes, "Yes, I do."
It reminds me of how I had inadvertently divulged that the janitors were throwing toys down and then never happened again.
Yeah, like only after do you realize the ramifications of what you've said. But yeah, I think I was very naive.
Have you ever had a teacher surprise you with their understanding of you?
Yeah, I did. I think it was my year 11 and 12 physics teacher. I felt really seen, and she created so much passion for me in the subject. She really encouraged me to get past my issues with homework, and when I answered a question, would push me up, would not lump me in where I had already been graded. I really put it down to her passion for really succeeding in my last couple of years at high school. Like I had some teachers make fun of my assignments in front of classes.
Would make fun of you?
Yeah, made fun of my assignment.
What assignment?
It was to create a movie poster, and I was like just into computers and used the whole load of clip art for my movie poster. And she just found it so funny. And she made a joke in front of the class and held it up and was like, "It could be like this." And then everyone then laughed. And there was some really beautiful work by other students. But yeah, that was pretty rough.
Did she think that you knew that it was funny?
No, I did it seriously. Yeah. I would never hold up a kid's artwork and say, "This is a joke."
Are there any moments these days as an adult?
Yeah. I think day to day, I don't always know if I'm being that kid who used clip art in my work versus the kid who, wowed. And I think today I at least think on that dimension of what my outputs are.
We started this conversation with you saying you wanted people to like you, you wanted to stand out, you wanted to be on stage.
I have 100 times more confidence than I did as a kid. For example, I definitely know I'm not a natural singer, but it doesn't matter. I still really enjoy karaoke, and sorry whoever goes with me.
Why are you apologizing?
Because I'm still going to do it. And it might not sound great, that's all.
All right. I think we need to get to the interview.
Yes.
So our guest today is the brilliant mind behind the Evolutionary Parenting Podcast, Dr. Tracy Cassels. Her groundbreaking research on empathy and theory of mind in young children has been published internationally and stems from a BA in cognitive science from UC Berkeley and both an MA in clinical psychology and a PhD in developmental psychology from the University of British Columbia. I stumbled upon her show around the time we had our daughter, but today she joins us for a chat about some of the quirky behaviors I've been unpacking in my stories, specifically being a troublemaker as a kid. Thanks for taking the time to speak with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
To get us started, I wanted to mention an empathy teaching strategy Megan and I use when our daughter hits or yells at one of us. This is not so much happening anymore, but Megan introduced me to this idea of instead of primarily scolding her, we first ask the victim. Let's say if she hit Megan, I would ask her if she's okay and offer support. The goal being to help her prioritize empathy as a reaction in a heightened emotional state, as opposed to just being empathetic. Showing it to somebody else is much more powerful. I wanted to mention this as an entry-level thought before asking you to tell us what first got you interested in studying empathy in kids.
It came to me actually from an opposite side. I first started out looking at psychopathic traits in children, what is happening to people who don't show any empathy. So I started looking at, the range of empathy and empathetic traits in young children without a diagnosis. What caused these differences? Could we identify why some children would be more or less likely to be empathic with others? And through that, I became more interested in how we can foster empathy as a norm. Because I'll be honest, the rates of empathy have been declining for many years. And most of those studies look at kind of college-age students. So what is it that we do in our culture as parents, as teachers that might be inhibiting this or looking elsewhere? How might we foster it? Then how do you modify a society around that? How do you modify a structure so that you could try to teach some level of it to a certain degree to kind of change how children are interacting with the world? But that really comes down to what's going on in the first place. So kind of that purely academic, what is actually happening.
On that point of like what's actually happening,
We have a question about one of your episodes, episode 57. What happens to the couple when they become parents? What stuck with me about this episode was the idea of studying and documenting us and our relationship as we become parents. In fact, some of the original ideas behind our show came from how I perceived my parents as these big giant heads. Like, do you remember how strange it was if you saw one of your grade school teachers outside of school? You're like, they're more than just teachers? You're like, I thought you slept at school, But so in the same way, we are more than just parents. So I wondered if documenting our challenges, personal and parental, might help curb that phenomenon for us as parents. In other words, beyond producing a podcast like this, do you have any advice, or can you speak to any research about how else we can humanize or contextualize our role in our kids' lives?
That's a great question.
One of the things as a parenting tool, you write a letter on their birthday every year. So it's kind of documenting the last year with them, but also your journey as their parent
Through that time.
So you go through, this year was really hard.
And you can write to them as if they're 18. Feelings, struggles, everything.
In a way that makes sense for them because they are then old enough.
And it's funny.
I'm just going to segue with a little story. My mom passed away coming up on 11 years ago now. And it wasn't until she was gone and we're going through some of her poetry that we found from years ago that we'd never seen, that we realized, oh my God, our mother was beyond what we had known her as, right? There's so many stories from her past, even that happened before me, that informed who she became. And so I've thought a lot about how do I share these with my children, but also not burden them with it, right? And that it's a fine line, I think, to navigate because our kids need to see us first and foremost
as their parents.
But, when I work one-on-one with families, one of the most crucial things I did was, okay, let's talk about what are you doing for you, right? Even if you get 1 hour a month, or maybe you get up to a couple hours a week when they're a bit older and you have support and care and whatnot, it brings you out of you just being the mom mentality yourself. Like you get to parent how you want to parent, but you carve out that chunk that says, okay, and now I get to be the me I want to be.
It sounds on the surface a little selfish, but I do think that showing your children that you have interests that aren't just about them, while at the same time making sure that you have an interest in them, of course. And
self-care isn't saying me first,
It's saying me too.
And I think when we view it that way, if you look at how many hours a day you spend dedicated to your children, taking an hour at night or 2 hours on the weekend or whatever it is, it's not saying me first. And I think there are people, and in our culture, there's certainly people that say me first. And we've all seen them. And I think that's where it gets kind of that bad rap. We see this one side of people that are just all about themselves. That's not what we're talking about, right? Going from making music for a couple hours after doing everything and working and doing it all. That's not me first. That's making sure your mental sanity is taken care of and finding your passion
that you can actually explore and feel good about.
as an adult, I've noticed I'm often hyper self-aware. Growing up, I think I developed this as a result of trying to understand how people were reacting to me, or specifically why I couldn't be more in control of their reactions. So I'm wondering how or when you approach making your kids aware of potential cognitive or emotional challenges that they're probably going to have a piece of. We assume, for example, as a kid, I wasn't self-aware or empathetic enough to ask, why do I keep acting out at school, or why is that bad?
So I am going to go out there and say that I think at all ages, as soon as they talk, there's ways to present this kind of information. And I think it's hugely important to always take the view as parents, when you find this frustration, they're acting up, they're doing this,
It's all that. I find it really important
to go and say, okay, my kid's not giving me a hard time, or giving the school a hard time, or giving whoever a hard time.
My kid's having a hard time.
And if you start a discussion, even at young ages with your kids like this, it can be like, okay, we have this thing in our family where sometimes we get really hyper. We find it really hard to stop. We find it really hard to focus. And especially if you're asked to sit down and pay attention, it can be really hard for us. And that's okay, because also on the flip side, we get to be more creative. We get to do all sorts of, good things.
And I think it is good to present it ahead of time.
Because by giving it context, giving them The vocabulary, she's going to take your interpretation of it, not the schools, the peers, the other people who may not understand, put on her instead. Because with all of these, there's two sides of the coin. Our society focuses on the disruptive elements, the difficult ones.
Oh, you can't read. You're behind in school. Stop doing this. You're disrupting the classroom. Your behavior is a problem.
But I think what you do in that stage of parenting is let them know that you believe in their goodness, that you believe that whatever is happening is a struggle for them too.
And so you're on their side to try and figure it out.
Where does the troublemaker phase fit in on the spectrum between, say, something to be concerned about versus harmless boundary pushing?
I think there's almost
no behavior that I would deem abnormal outside of,
fire setting and torturing small animals.
Those are all things you want to get checked out.
But by and large, young children have incredibly limited impulse control. There's a great fMRI image of a brain in terms of the development of the prefrontal cortex.
In the 5-year-old brain, the area is completely underdeveloped. So even by 5, we're still looking at unbelievably limited impulse control. And so they're driven by what happens in that moment. And more emotionally charged a moment, even with us adults, the less control we have, right? So as an adult, if something bad happens and you're already stressed out, that's when we snap. We apologize, but we have to kind of go back and be like, oh God, I totally messed that one up.
And children experience that to insane degrees. And I know there's those kids that behave, that are really well behaved a lot of the time. And I see 3 options that make sense from a biological perspective. 1, you're catching them at a really good time. Their best chance at control is when they're in a very mellow state. Their energy levels aren't too high. Emotionally, they're really regulated. They're not hungry. They're not tired. They're not overstimulated. The laundry list, you hit this peak moment and you're seeing a child who's just like zen. Now, in that,
Mixed with that huge variability in children's threshold for what triggers going over.
and so there's a whole subgroup of children that are identified readily in the research whose threshold is very low.
So they may be the ones that get labeled as troublemakers or all sorts of other things because their threshold for getting overstimulated and emotionally dysregulated is dramatically lower than other kids. So in that same moment, they cannot regulate even close to as well as other kids do in the same situation. So we first have to look at that individual variability. Then have you caught a kid in that moment below that threshold when everything's going well? That's the best example of your well-behaved kid.
Your second one is that you have a very shy child. Some children internalize instead of externalizing. They don't act it out when they get stressed or dysregulated. They shut down.
And it looks like a well-behaved child because they don't act out. They might sit very passively in the classroom. They might be quiet or shy or this or that. And some kids just are. But some kids are looking like they're behaving well when really they're struggling on the inside. And I've spoken to so many adults who had anxiety as children and said, yeah, that was me. Everyone said I was the most well-behaved child and I was so miserable, but I couldn't express it. So I don't think we want to view that as a positive. And then, of course, the last,
I think is worse-ish, but kind of on the same level, is when kids have been scared into behaving.
fear is one of the greatest inhibitors of impulse control, and you don't want it to be. That's not a good way to learn things, but we are driven by fear. If I'm afraid, I stop, right? Or I'm able to inhibit other things because I'm so scared of the outcome. If you have been conditioned to be so afraid that you don't act out,
that's not a good child who is behaving well. It's a terrified child.
And the problem is, I think in our culture, there's a lot of the third, unfortunately, happening. When you look at how schools punish children for acting out or being afraid, there can be the social fear of being made fun of. But discipline-wise is still relatively on the harsher side in Western cultures, right? Like some places are great and have banned corporal punishment and everything, but there's still a lot of the harsher physical side, but especially the emotional. Like people get mad at their kids and they separate from them. No, you can't come near me. And a child with that, you talk about fear, the fear of abandonment for a child is huge. So if they think being bad results in mom and dad not loving me, that can stifle that. So when I see kids acting out or having a hard time or losing it, and
I see a calm parent, I'm like, kudos to you.
Because that's exactly what your kid needs, is to see you able to be there and be calm. And interestingly, when they're not getting a reaction and you're not chasing them, you're not trying to calm them down, you're not even trying to like reason with them, suddenly they calm. Then you can start to talk about what's happening. But all of those behaviors are so normal. And I wish they were more normalized because we don't bring kids into spaces where they're allowed to express themselves. They do, and we make them leave. And that doesn't teach them how to be in those spaces. But more importantly, it doesn't teach others how to accept children into those spaces. And so if we look at the root causes of it and work towards stabilizing those, you're still going to have moments where kids lose it because that's just kind of how life is. But then they learn how to deal with it because you're approaching it in a different way instead of scolding.
It's like, oh, look, are you hungry right now? Is that what's happening? And they can start to map later. Oh, I'm feeling off. I think I need food.
So let's say I'm disruptive in a class. Other students, their education is being affected by my disruption. Is it the teacher's responsibility to take time from the other students?
I think it depends on what are the supports in place, right? There's a great study about providing kids. It was in a US classroom. Sadly, the study did great, and then they never did anything with it. But giving them little bicycles to pedal on underneath the table there, their grades went up dramatically.
I heard about this, and in one of my years, I think grade 2 or 3, I remember they gave me a headset and put on whatever the hell was on the tape. It would be like kids' music. Zero distraction, zero focus issues. I'd be humming along, doing whatever that I needed to do. And I only realized 20 years later that background sounds is a cognitive enhancement feature. You just block out sounds and suddenly you have focus.
It's interesting for young kids especially. There's a study that found they do better at retention when they're allowed to do other things as opposed to having to sit and focus. Give a kid a bunch of Lego to play with while you're reading a story. They retain more of the story when they're playing with Lego than if you make them sit and listen to the story.
This is stuff I'm hoping. It doesn't sound like it's being implemented, like you said, very much in Canada, but
it depends. There's other alternative schools. Unfortunately, here they're not public.
No.
So do focus
on trying to create these environments. And I agree, it's absolutely necessary to do it because teachers should have these tools in their toolkit so that it's not taking away from the rest of the class. It'd be like, oh, look, you might be struggling with this. Let's go get one of those little pedal bikes and see how that goes. And maybe put on some music in the background and off you go. And imagine if they had that just available. It's easier for them. It's easier for everyone, right?
And that's what I say is it unfair to teachers to put some burden? It's unfair when you don't give them the tools. Then it's unfair.
I have a question about one of your episodes. Episode 38, What Kind of Parenting Helps Children Develop Emotion Regulation? You speak about telling your kids when you're struggling, saying things like, I'm having a bad day. This is something David and I definitely try and do a lot more. And especially me, it's definitely the stuff that I need to work on because I bottle things up. Like I'm that little pot that boils over. And for the rest of the time, I'm calm, cool, collected. People don't know there's this raging, boiling pot. But my question is, on one hand, we're trying to teach emotional self-regulation. And on the other, it's about being transparent about our own emotional state, which is often dysregulated. So do you have advice on how to balance these two?
So we teach emotion regulation techniques, right? How to do your deep breathing, how to do whatever else. But whatever the little thing is that goes for your kid, it's only good if they know how to recognize their dysregulation. And that is part of the vocalizing. It is being able to say, I feel this way. And more importantly, when we say things out loud, we believe it more. So we almost have to say it out loud to make it real, or else we come up with excuses. We hide it. We don't want to deal with it, right? You talk about your pot boiling over. If you keep it all in there and it doesn't get said, it stays in. If it gets said and comes out, well, now it's out. And there's a lot more space out here than there is inside the pot. So it becomes a point where you say, I am really frustrated right now. I'm in pain. And as soon as you say that, you can be like, oh yeah, this has nothing to do with my kid. And your kids can learn the same thing. Oh, this has nothing to do with mom or the dog or whatever, my sibling or whatever it is that goes on. When they start to see people recognize it and vocalize it, and they follow that path, they're now becoming aware of A, being open to talking about it, which leads to dealing with it and utilizing those techniques that we have. But B, it helps them recognize what really is going on. And then I always add to it, it's not just vocalizing it in the moment every time. The other step is when it happens, I have to think, And then I have to have a conversation whether it's appropriate with my child or on my own. I say, okay, this was what was happening and this is how I felt. What am I specifically going to do next time to try and avoid the dysregulation? What can I do ahead of time? And I make myself think through that process and go through it. And then I usually forget about it the next time, and then I have to go through it again. But then usually, after a few times, suddenly you've got it. And those things that used to cause dysregulation no longer cause it because you're preemptively dealing with them.
Another one from your show, episode 52, How Does Media Use Affect Our Kids? Your guest made a distinction between using technology to consume versus create. And I bring this up in relation to platforms like TikTok. It's primarily a platform for consuming content, but it's only successful because there are enough users that are also creating with it. So I wonder what these tools in these apps are teaching kids about being creative when the goal is about getting likes or shares. So do you think these tools are fostering creative interests, like a gateway to more creativity, or should we be as critical of using them to create as we are of using them to consume?
Each kid will look at those tools differently and see different avenues. So I'll use an example. My son, when he was younger, very into monster trucks, right? Like young boys are. And he started watching some of the YouTube channels that had kids setting up ramps. And what would lead to it was he would now go around the house creating all these ramps out of random things. So that bit of watching it and doing it, it sparked creativity for him. It was a good thing to see. And since he's had other things he's watched that we're not fostering creativity or sociability, that we've shut it down. But yes, it really does depend. And I think within each child, certain tools will be more consumption than creative, certainly. Or even not just the tools. It can even be down to, what videos are you watching that can lead to that distinction? But it really depends on what they're doing.
This is more of an opinion, but creativity, the creative process, I believe it needs to have a level of friction. And when they're creating with apps like TikTok, for example, it's about the output more than it is the process. They need to make the creative process as frictionless as possible so people can easily create more and more. So I do wonder if the tool is designed exclusively to make content easier and faster, is there something that we should be worried about there?
I think so. I mean, my daughter's most creative was she actually did a book, and it was like, you talk about friction. She came up with the idea.
And then she did play Nation Little People for all of it.
Then with my husband, who does video editing, they took photos of everything. They found the background. She had to use Adobe
to get the backgrounds in and mix it all together, and then placement of the text. And it took like a year to get done. But it was a reminder that, okay, sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it takes a really long time, but it's worth it at the end because you get this.
Yeah. Along those lines, but a little bit more to the future, have you been following any of the hype around AI this year?
My husband's kept me updated on it all.
Yeah.
And all of it. Yeah. So, yes.
But specifically large language models like ChatGPT. I'm not going to get too technical, but basically there's a model and that's trained with billions of pages of pre-existing text. I think of this training data the same way we all come with inherited genetics from our parents. Then similar to parenting, the next step is to socialize the kids or the model, give them the skills or the interface to make all that genetic information functional. I bring this up because AI and our kids are both in these early stages of their development. And as parents, we should be aware that AI will have a much greater effect on future generations than computers, the internet or social media had on us. So do you think we should be nurturing an awareness of AI in our kids' lives or letting it evolve behind the scenes or some combination?
I'm of two minds, and this is just my opinion because I'm facing it, I think, like every other parent. If my parents had tried to talk to me about social media before the rise, I'm not sure what on earth I would have gotten from them about it.
So the idea that we could somehow preemptively help our kids with what it's going to become seems like the misguided question, because I think the issue is, how do we get them to appreciate what technology is at each stage as it's happening? So is it a tool for good, bad? How do we use it? What does it do? And bringing up, I think, from our experiences of what we know now, not what we're hypothesizing will happen. How do we explain, okay, these are some of the dangers of this, right? Like, you watching the screen too much can really hurt your feelings. You know, when you're talking to really young kids, it can make you feel angry and frustrated. And, you know, we always have to be aware that these are the things that come with technology as we know it. And so I think that's our way of navigating it forward as parents, is knowing that we're not going to have an iota of an idea as to what this is going to look like for our kids 5 years from now.
Sooner, I think. I mean, kids or students are already using it to do their homework. And thinking back to TikTok, how it seems there's this growing expectation of a frictionless process to getting things done, solving problems, being creative.
I think that's part of the problem with our education system that rewards output versus process.
Yes.
And if your answer is always who got the right answer first, then it's a flawed educational paradigm. If you focus on, okay, how to learn, how to manage, and I think it's going to change just for that very reason. It has to inherently change education as it is because information will be so readily available. Our testing and memorization of facts and doing all this, that is not what it is. It's going to be how do we integrate knowledge together? How do I take that fact? What do I do with it? That has to be the more important part. How am I integrating it into something larger?
This has been great, Tracy. There was one bonus question. It was a quick one. If you had any latest bleeding edge science books, papers, studies, people to follow, if you have any recommendations, we'd love to hear.
I would say, honestly, all of the people I've interviewed, most of them are researchers. They're all doing kind of cutting edge research in their fields. I will say, I think if you're looking at research, one of the underutilized fields is anthropology. They are looking at the human condition across a variety of cultures and experiences and really helping us make sense of why there's differences.
In terms of books,
I'm going to say Meredith Small, she has Our Babies Ourselves, which is like the only must read. She has second one kids. Like, what is culture saying is bad versus is this bad?
I will say a book that is not parenting related,
But yet spoke so relevantly to the human condition for me is Sebastian Junger's Tribe. You can read it in like a couple hours. It's like a long essay. It's one of my all-time favorites. Just examining our need for connection as humans across a variety of situations, from war to being in the army and the effects when we don't have that connection. And to me, when I think about parenting, it is all about connection, right? That is what we're aiming to do. So seeing the importance of that in the rest of our lives and how we do things differently is just such a crucial look at things.
Awesome.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much again.
they have really interesting questions. Usually I get up at sleep, so I got to admit it's like nice to actually talk about other things, and AI and everything is really like bringing together all the different pieces from out there. So thank you for that.
So today we're going to do something a little different to close the show. It's not really on topic, but we think it's an interesting segment to have. Living in Amsterdam, it's easy to feel disconnected from our countrymen. So Megan and I have each researched news from our Commonwealth homelands.
Commonwealth. Such an old-time word.
Yeah, it is. Like it should only be heard when chanting, "For the good of the Commonwealth," after agreeing to crush another rebellion or something.
Is it even still a thing?
It's most of the countries that used to be colonies of the British Empire, except for the US.
And I think the Australian flag still has a little miniature British flag on it, like a tramp stamp.
All right, what do you got for me?
So, the Health Service of Tasmania, one of the states in Australia, the little island off the bottom, is offering salaries 10 to 15K more than what they're paying in the UK at NHS. And so if we boil it down to what does that really mean? Well, last year, more than a third of the British Medical Association members plan to move abroad, and 42% of that third are going to head to Australia.
You know what? It's not a bad deal. More money, more sun.
Yep. And it's funny, the Aussies, they're directly advertising the jobs to these UK doctors. Here's the line that they're running. "Hey, mate, are you a UK-based junior doctor who wants job stability, great remuneration, and the clinical support you need to develop your career? Come on down under." Well, I added the "come on down under" part, but this is directly on the British Medical Journal website, which is wild. Sun, beaches, cafe culture, loads to do. What more could you really want? Oh yeah, family and friends. Does this remind you of anyone, David?
I know.
feel like these doctors will commence their expat life and have many conversations about missing family. When can we get teleportation? Do you think in our lifetime or our daughters?
No, not teleportation. Because then I think the first step of teleportation will be it kills you and makes a new one of you somewhere else. And I'm not sure I'm into that.
Too many questions about what is the self.
Hey, they've managed to teleport 3 photons.
Yeah, photons.
Just a few more molecules in a human body, right?
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, got it. That's mostly news to me.
That's a good name for this segment.
What?
That's news to me.
Yeah, I love it.
But we have to say it after every story.
Oh, but of course.
Though that also means we need a little stinger track.
Stinger trap?
All right, I'm up. So, BC, British Columbia, a province on the west coast of Canada, is decriminalizing hard drugs in a 3-year trial allowing anyone over the age of 18 to carry up to 2.5 grams of illegal drugs, including opioids, cocaine, methamphetamine, and MDMA. So anyone carrying those drugs for personal use won't be arrested, charged, or have their drugs seized. I think that's a good thing for people with drug problems, because then they can feel more comfortable to get help. But we also don't want kids to think it's okay to use these drugs until they've gone through the naturally hormone-addled stages of their lives. I'm joking, of course, but it is scary that if we keep saying, just say no, we'll have similar problems to abstinence. We know the hard drug scene here in Amsterdam.
How do you know it?
Common mouth. Common tongue. Common wag.
Common knowledge.
And actually, it's confirmed again that the Netherlands is the drug capital of Europe, based on sewage testing.
Who are these sewage testers? Because we had sewage testers in COVID that told us how much corona was there. I know we got sewage testers for our drugs.
I don't know they're going down there like in a wetsuit or something. I think there's probably a sensor down there that's automatically reading the information. But we also know that most Dutch kids don't even smoke weed. It's this whole thing that if you make it a big deal, it becomes a big deal. So going back to just don't say no. So anyway, I'm curious how this develops.
Me too. But for now, got it. Canada is soon to be the legal drug capital of North America. That is also mostly news to me.
No, that's 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 news to me.
That's news to me.
That's news to me.
That's news to me. Big Giant Heads is written, produced, and hosted by me, David Fasulo. Megan Orr is my invaluable co-host and sounding board and mother to our baby, the space baby and co-conspirator for these episodes. Intro and all music in this episode was composed by my brother, Matt Fasulo. If you're looking for a composer or music producer of any kind, check out his work at mattfasulo.com. And if you enjoyed the show, check us out on Patreon. Consider following us on Twitter or Instagram. Search for Big Giant Heads on both platforms. Or grab the links for the website. Visit biggiantheadspodcast.com for all questions, comments, or inquiries. Thanks for listening.